This is a joint paper, myself and Denis. I'm going to cover the climate change bits, and Denis will talk about the energy dimension. You might wonder, why are, in this context of today, issues for the next government, do we pick energy and climate change? Well, as you'll discover as the presentation develops, the exchequer implications of not doing something are quite extraordinary and could expose the exchequer to very significant risks in the medium term. And also, we are in a policy-taking perspective. The decisions that we have to implement have already been agreed at EU level, and what the next government has to do effectively is to implement some very, very tough targets. We have to cut our greenhouse gas emissions by 40% over a period of 40 years to 2030, which might sound an easy statistic, but will be incredibly difficult to do. We have to significantly improve the penetration rate of renewables in the economy, and we also have to really up our game in terms of what we're doing in terms of energy efficiency. The agendas we're going to cover, we're going to talk a little bit about how we've met these targets. You discover we're not doing particularly well. I'll also make the case that we probably have a target that is too high, and we would argue that the government, the next government, should be going to Brussels looking for a lower target for our non-emissions trading greenhouse gas emissions. You might find that strange, but I believe that is a case that needs to be made. We'll talk a bit about the National Mitigation Plan, the White Paper on Energy. Curiously, they're two separate documents, not an integrated document. Specifically, I want to talk about agriculture. The carbon budget will be effectively the government's balance sheet of revenue and expenditure on climate change and energy, as recently explained by Deeper, and there's some very interesting figures there. And we talk about some flagship projects we believe that could be put into the public arena. And last, we talk about leadership, again a common theme throughout this morning. There is a UN conference in Paris a few weeks hence. Most of the countries participating have already indicated their pledges. The European Union has tabled its pledge. It will succeed. You'll hear a lot of headlines a few weeks hence, but the pledges, when combined, will not do enough. The climate scientists are saying at the moment the pledges will increase global temperatures by 2.5%. The target is 2%. So despite all these pledges, we're still on a troublesome pathway to global warming. The European Union's package is agreed. Ireland has to adapt and implement this package. Our hands are tied behind our back in the sense that the vast majority of the detail of this package has been agreed. There will be a new emissions trading directive. It's actually being negotiated as we speak. There will be a new, what's called ESD, I use a lot of abbreviations, which is an effort sharing directive. In other words, how Ireland's share might be calculated. I'm going to talk about that in quite a few minutes. There will be a new renewables directive, a new energy efficiency directive. Now, if you ask me, what are the collective impacts? What is the regulatory impact assessment of all of this on Ireland? I have not the first idea, and I suspect the government doesn't have the first idea, because if it has, it hasn't been consulting stakeholders on this issue, instead of which it's been looking at other issues. More about that anon. So what does a tonne of carbon look like? It's the size of a house. Do you know a tonne of carbon was that big? We have actually 70 million tonnes of carbon is what we were emitting in 2005. 70 million houses worth of carbon. And we have to cut that by quite an amount, 20 to 30 million over the period to 2030. Now, that's an awful lot of carbon to get rid of. We were very lucky we had a recession, and we got rid of about 12 to 13 million tonnes of carbon, primarily because of a sharp fall in GDP, and electricity consumption and production is very closely correlated to economic activity. So when economic activity dips, energy consumption dips, and carbon, which is a result of energy, falls. So we've actually achieved a huge degree of compliance, nothing to do with national policy, but due to the fact we had a very good recession. There are two policy directives that determine how you manage your carbon. One is called the Emissions Trading Scheme, which about 100 companies in Ireland fall into this. They're called the ETS operators. And what they do is governed at EU level. So if the ESB or Bord na Móna or whoever do brilliantly well at reducing their carbon, it has no impact on Ireland. The benefit doesn't accrue to the Irish economy, it accrues at European level. We have very tough targets already, and the targets are going to get tougher. And the biggest impact of these targets will fall on the energy sector. The energy sector is by far the biggest emitter of carbon in the country. The biggest plant within that is Moneypoint. Moneypoint emits around 5 to 6 million tonnes of carbon burning cheap coal every year, which is about 10% of the total carbon emitted in the entire economy. So one plant accounts for a very significant percentage point of our total carbon emissions. There is a draft directive being negotiated to force the annual reduction of greenhouse gas emissions through the emissions trading scheme. It's probably, I think, it's a common procedure, common position stage at the European Union level. And Ireland will not be able to get any wriggle room. We're going to be forced to increase our annual agreed binding legal target to reduce most of these emissions through the ETS. Now, this only applies to 100 companies in Ireland. Then outside the emissions trading scheme is the rest of us. It covers transport, agriculture, the built environment, both public sector and private sector as households and as businesses. We all burn and use fuel, and fuel emits carbon, so we're all covered. The distance to target, the DTT as they call it in the jargon, is potentially enormous if the current EU rules apply. We will not meet our targets. We have no chance at the moment of meeting these targets. And the biggest consequence is that if we don't meet the targets, we get fined. We get fined for every tonne we don't mitigate, and that fine will fall on the Irish taxpayer. More about that anon, because the figures are quite large. Now, the argument can, and I believe should be made, that the share that we have at the moment to reduce our carbon emissions by 20% is far too high. It was set in 2007 when the economy was doing very well, and as usual in Brussels they said GDP per capita, if you have a higher than average GDP per capita in the European Union, you have to take a tougher target, and that's what Ireland did. We have a minus 20% target. Now that should be reduced because an awful lot of the countries whose GNP has actually improved in the intervening period have lower targets than we have. They've only got 10%. And I would argue, and it's explained in the detail of the paper, that that should be the maximum incremental target for Ireland, no more than 10%. And there are good reasons for that. First of all, because of the recession, we weren't able to invest and didn't have the money to invest in renewable energy or energy efficiency. And as a consequence, some of the targets couldn't be achieved because we didn't have the money. Also, at EU level, and bear in mind the targets are set at EU level, the EU is actually doing quite well. The Commission has said that by 2030, probably they will be at minus 30%. So the European Union as a whole is broadly on target to meet its climate change ambitions, whereas we're not. We're out of kilter. So if the EU is more or less sorted, why should they impose a higher burden on Ireland? I don't think it's reasonable. Also, we have an issue that if we have a very strong renewables penetration and even better performance on energy efficiency, we'll pull carbon out of the economy, which is the plan. And also you have to say Ireland is unique because of agriculture, and more about that. Our agriculture emissions are at the top end of the scale, and because we have such a dominant agriculture sector, we need to not to have such a high target. The EPA has warned we're not going to meet our targets by 2020, and as there is effectively a building up of non-compliance over the decade to 2030, the distance to target gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and as a consequence the fines we have to pay will get larger, larger and larger. And there is a huge exposure to the taxpayer because the Exchequer pays the fines, not the individual operators. That's current policy. Now, the Minister announced recently that he is, quote, not surprised that this is happening, but neither he nor the EPA have actually stated what is going to happen in the future. We have to wait for the National Mitigation Plan. The National Mitigation Plan is a very interesting name. Its mitigation is basically prevention. We want to prevent emissions happening. It's out for consultation. The consultation has finished. I'm hoping it will cover the period to 2030. It'd be very helpful if somebody published and carried out a comprehensive regulatory impact assessment of all these of the EU's 2030 policy as a backdrop to the National Mitigation Plan, under several scenarios as to what the impacts would be if we choose options A, B or C. It is a requirement of Cabinet procedures that a regulatory impact assessment be carried out, but it hasn't happened. But it would be very helpful if it did. Obviously, a lot of work has gone on in terms of identifying the marginal abatement cost curves for different sectors, and they will be built into the National Mitigation Plan. Business as usual, in other words, doing nothing, isn't really an option given the stretch targets that we have, and certainly doing nothing in agriculture isn't an option. There are huge issues around the exchequer implications depending on how we opt, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. But what hasn't really been in the public discourse, and where there seems to be an absence of any thinking, is can we buy our way out of all these targets? In other words, there are already mechanisms in the directives that allow us to use what are called statistical transfers, offsets, joint projects. And is it a much more cost-effective way for the national economy to use these accounting devices to buy our way out or to become technically compliant with these legally binding targets, as distinct from spending billions and billions investing in mitigation measures? There's a balance to be struck, and we talk about that in a few minutes. And also it's hugely important that we assess in the National Mitigation Plan if we have a really strong focus on investment in renewables and in energy efficiency, and for example we pull 30% of carbon out of public buildings, how that will impact on the National Mitigation Plan and indeed on the Energy White Paper. So there's a lot to be discussed, and this plan will end up on the table of the next government for implementation. And I only hope not only does it set out what has to be done, but it sets out what budgets have to be provided, what has to be done by when, and who has to do it. We're very good at producing strategies, but as was mentioned earlier on, we're not particularly good at linking the strategy to delivery. And I hope this plan really does focus on the delivery dimension. Our two friends here are responsible with their colleagues for an awful lot of methane emissions. Methane emissions happen when cows are chewing away, and they account for the vast majority of Irish emissions. There's nothing you can do about it short of shooting the national herd, and nobody's going to suggest that. But the reality is that cows belch and I'm on record here, I can't be using bad language. So we have a problem. We emit probably 20 million tonnes, actually 19.7 million tonnes of carbon or methane from these fellows. And Teagasc reckon that that figure isn't going to change because it is not possible. In fact, the figure is going to increase because it is government policy to increase the herd and to export more dairy and beef. So agriculture emissions are actually increasing. So what's the plan? Well, there's a project called Climate Smart Agriculture that's looking at all of this. In reality, they're basically saying that agriculture shouldn't be subject to these impacts at all because we need to feed 40, 50 million people at European level, and therefore agriculture shouldn't have to pay the penalty. But that, to my mind, again, looking at the social costs of investment, as was mentioned earlier on, doesn't stack up. We have a carbon tax on fuel. Why can't we have a carbon tax on agriculture emissions? Why can't we put a price on dairy and beef? What are the impacts? Should the general taxpayer cross-subsidise the farming community because they won't meet the costs of overproduction of agriculture? We have a legally binding target to cut emissions in agriculture, and if we don't, we will be fined. Who pays the fine? Whether it's through a carbon tax, a carbon price, or through the general exchequer. There is a very, very large debate to be had here. I'm not suggesting that there should be necessarily a carbon tax, but I would like somebody in the climate smart agriculture piece to put the figures on the table, and let's have a mature discussion as to what would work and what wouldn't work. Letting agriculture off scot-free isn't acceptable for the rest of the economy. So why should we allow the farmers get away scot-free, nor should they say should the rest of the economy get away scot-free? We're all in a collective problem of undercompliance. One of the solutions is this wonderful thing called LULUCF. That's land use change and forestry. And at Brussels, they're about to produce a proposal to say that agriculture emissions should be linked to emissions from land and forestry. Forests absorb carbon. Land absorbs carbon. So when you put the package together, you can then offset the forest carbon, forest sinks against agriculture emissions. That is very positive. It's recommended at UN level, and I really do hope that agriculture, the third pillar of agriculture, is put into this LULUCF. However, I looked at the figures, and unless we triple or even quadruple our forest planting, this is not going to happen. There will not be enough additional forest carbon accounted for until probably 2030, even if we started to plant the forests now, because it takes quite a period, up to nearly a decade, even with fast-growing trees, for the trees to grow to a certain extent that they have the maximum amount of absorption, or they absorb the carbon. So the solution among the agriculture people is, this is going to sort our problem out. It ain't. It will partly solve the problem, and I have seen no figures as to who's going to pay for all of this. At the moment, premiums and grants are given to private individuals to grow forestry. If this proposal comes out and you put a price on carbon, on forest carbon, you actually attach a value to the price of forest carbon, it could dramatically affect the investment decisions of Kilcha and many others. And it is something that is worth looking at, and it certainly would help the agriculture community, which would be positive. However, if agriculture get linked into this new third pillar, the targets for the rest of the economy will inevitably increase. Brussels is not going to give away a special deal for agriculture and forestry and not increase the targets for the rest of the economy. So there is a risk that one part of the economy, agriculture, could be resolved with this, but the rest of the economy will suffer, and we have to be aware of that. Minister Gormley stood up for 2 to 3 years and the day after the budget delivered a carbon budget. We haven't heard of one since. There hasn't been a carbon budget for 5 years. My definition of a carbon budget is slightly different. It is the balance sheet approach to the exchequer, its revenues and income arising from climate change and investments in energy that are related to climate change. And when you look at the figures, when you look at them in their collective, they are quite large. We collect 385 million in carbon tax. It goes straight to the exchequer bottom line. It's not a public case, it's general revenue. You increase carbon tax by 10 euros a tonne, you probably get another billion, should I say. So a small increase in carbon tax probably would generate €1 billion over 5 years, which would be enough probably to pay our compliance costs. So another €10, probably at 2 cents a litre, we probably could sort out most of our compliance costs. We also get revenue from the sale of ETS allowances, quite an amount of money, 41 million this year. You multiply that over 10 years, somewhere short of €500 million. We levy to support refit schemes. The figure for this year is 174 million. That was high because the price of fossil fuel is low. We have investments in the public capital programme for renewables and energy efficiency. Denis will talk about that. But what is disturbing is that the UCC and others have identified potentially massive fines. Massive. The DPERs actually calculate these as billions of euros if we do not meet our renewable energy requirements. These are legally binding targets. If we don't meet the targets, we have to pay fines. And the figure is the billions of euros. Now, how that's broken down, I couldn't find out. But the DPER has produced a paper quantifying that amount. So who pays for this compliance? Hence the need for a carbon budget, for somebody to look at all the aspects of inputs and outputs of this particular carbon space. We don't have a policy hypothecation in this country. So in other words, if money is collected from auctioning revenues. It goes into the general exchequer. It is not used for carbon mitigation measures. That's current government policy. Now, this is the sort of exercise that the new National Expert Advisory Group on Climate Change should and could be looking at. Because you cannot make decisions amongst looking at the social rate of return on investment until you know the magnitude of the problem and the exchequer's exposure. And as I said, the figures are not insignificant. They are literally running to billions of euros. Now, that figure, to my mind, assumes a price of carbon that is very much at the high end of the Richter scale in terms of forecasts. But certainly, if we had to pay hundreds of millions of fines every year, it's still a large amount of money, which isn't very visible in the current climate because nobody's looked at this particular issue. And we move on to energy.
Okay.
Our energy man.
Thank you very much, Peter. Good morning, everybody. I've got a clear message from Julie. The clock is running. Okay. Now, I have 3 slides. I'm going to dip into them and make a few general comments. Before focusing on the specific of this particular slide, I want to make 1 or 2 general comments on the energy area. People who get to look closely at Ireland's energy policy, inevitably after a while they say, but hold on, Denis, isn't there a bit of a conflict or a tension between policy X and policy Y? And is the policy all consistent and all that? And the answer is yes, there are inconsistencies, etc. But by the standards of some of our neighbours within the EU, some of our large neighbours, overall our energy policy is reasonably consistent and sort of understandable. I'm thinking particularly, if you look at Germany, for example, I don't have figures here, I don't have a slide, but Germany is financing massive subsidies for renewable energy, particularly on the solar area, multiples of what we are giving per kilowatt hour. At the same time, they are financing massive subventions to coal and steel, the old fossil fuel burning plant. A clear contradiction in policy. Look at GB. GB has done the full rounds in terms of they're the pioneers in the market would resolve everything. Now they are back, as some commentators, for example, Dieter Helen has highlighted, they are back to an extraordinary interventionist, centralised planning to try and resolve their issues. This is against the background where they are facing very urgent security of supply problems in the coming years. I was involved closely in the project the last year or 2 on trying to get renewable exports to GB. Fascinating project, and happy to talk about it at the panel discussions later on. But one of the clear frustrations that appeared to us and to my colleagues in the department was GB, the people, it get very, very difficult for people within the Department of Energy there to actually focus on how important this was. Where is GB energy policy going? They just don't know. So by the standards of some of our neighbours, our policies is not that inconsistent. No, I don't want to sound complacent. There are big issues facing us, all right. Okay, so that's just one sense of perspective. Now, if someone were to ask me, what is Ireland's energy policy perspective, or policy priority? What should be the overarching objective? I think it must be to meet our international binding obligations on climate change, however they turn out to meet those at least long-term costs to the consumer. And to the extent that we have some comparative advantages we can exploit, let's do that. If, as Peter suggests, if it makes more sense to Ireland Inc. to meet our obligations by using statistical transfers and counting devices, let's do it. There's no premium on being top of the class. Let's just meet ours. That's the overall objective, I would say. The other objective may be to the extent, as Peter says, our energy policy is largely given. There is still a bit of flex scope for the input into the precise details, how that will flesh out over the coming year or so, in terms of the scope for flexibility to be allowed in the emission sharing, to the extent, not emission sharing, but burden sharing, etc. The role of the ETS, the extent that should be taken into account in deciding the non-ETS. We've gone into some detail in these in the paper. But there is scope there for having some input into that. And I think the European Commission itself has demonstrated that they are quite open to the case for flexibility. So, for example, they have said 2030 there should be a binding renewables target of 27% for the EU. They have said that doesn't necessarily mean that each member state will have a binding objective. So to be meaningful, it will have to translate into something. But I think the Commission people themselves have accepted that there are limits. They've probably taken it as far as they can as regards the 2020 objectives, as regards prescribing a one-size-fits-all. There must be scope for each member state having more discretionary flexibility and how it should meet its EU aggregate obligations. Okay, you see that there's a graph there just illustrating our 2020 objectives. You can see for Ireland, the interesting point there is Ireland, that's just for the electricity sector, I should say. Our EU renewables aggregate target is 16% divided between electricity, transport and heating. But of course the biggest bulk is falling on the electricity at 40%. The interesting dimension there is the extent to which the vast bulk of that is presumably going to be met by wind generation. Because of the particular features of wind generation, it is intermittent. That poses a particular challenge facing a system like Ireland, which is an isolated island system, unlike, for example, Denmark, and which is probably going to remain isolated, even with further interconnection, because they do DC interconnectors. I won't go into all the details, but it's recognised that because of the laws of physics, that the challenges facing a single isolated synchronous system such as Ireland, the island of Ireland, is going to be different to facing large tracts of the EU. Okay. Now, wind, moving on, there's an indication of where we are. On the wind side, the presumption to date has been the bulk of our renewables obligations will be met by wind. It doesn't have to be that way. There is no rule saying it has to be by wind. But so far, the economics and the logistics suggest that the bulk of it will be met by wind. Sooner or later, there is a limit to how much wind the system can take, either from a technical point or indeed from a public acceptability perspective, be it for overhead lines or be it for wind farms. Often in the energy policy area, people like to exclude that. I say, but Dennis, that's a different problem. We like to think, I think we sort of flatter ourselves the extent to which energy policy considerations alone are going to determine this issue. There is a big issue of public acceptability. I'm not suggesting that the 40% will not be met largely by wind. I think it will, and I think wonderful efforts are being made on the technical side on redesigning our wholesale electricity market. We are pioneers in that regard, as regards developing a system which can accommodate levels of intermittent generation, which would have been unheard of 10 years ago, and which are being closely watched by international observers of this, including the US as well. So Ireland is something of a pioneer there. But at the same time, you have to look beyond wind, including, by the way, solar. And I won't say that just because people often scoff the idea of solar in Ireland, but in fact there was serious progress being made. I met some solar developers last week. You don't need to have great sun conditions. The scope of it probably is going to be fairly modest, could well be largely at the residential level, but it avoids a lot of the problems that planning issues, etc., that wind farms inevitably encounter. One or two other final points. Oh yes, what we flagged, Peter's paper and our paper, we flagged 3 or 4 flagship projects. One of them is this question of the case for converting Money Point to biomass. Now, because of the sheer scale of Money Point, inevitably it's a huge factor in what's going to happen to our generation industry over the next decade or so. It cannot go on burning cheap coal indefinitely. It makes nonsense of any commitment to climate change if that continues indefinitely. So what we have flagged in our paper is the case for actually looking at the economics of this. But I emphasize looking at the economics of this as a merchant project. I mean, on the face of it, the plant has a lot of advantages. First of all, it's there. It's built. It has a connection, so we can avoid all the difficult problems about how we're going to fight new connection policy, which is a big issue as regards greenfield investment projects. It has a big port that can accommodate all the importation of renewable feedstocks. It won't get a retail tariff, etc. By the same token, you won't have the savings in fuel imports that you would have if it was all wind. But realistically, I think it just has to be looked at. And let's see, does it wash its face commercially? That is a decision for the shareholder, wherever that would be. Okay, and the last point I mentioned in this rather rush through things is that let's not forget the role of natural gas. We have invested massively in our network. We have a large network. We have multiple sources now of carbon coming out, well, at least several sources coming on stream, and we have a small customer base. If we don't try to increase the takeoff of natural gas to displace fossil fuels, more carbon-intensive fossil fuels, we are only storing up costs for ourselves in terms of how to finance the network. So the role of natural gas in terms of transportation, heating and domestic level, possibly if money point, if the project that we mentioned, if that doesn't wash its face, there may well be a case for natural gas to money point, and which will take account of the economics of the network. Okay, I'll hand it back to Peter.
Yeah. There's a problem, potential problem about leadership. Again, we talked about this earlier on. We really believe that this needs to be driven at ministerial level, at cabinet level. Responsibility for climate change falls between 3 or 4 different departments. They're all doing very well individually, but we would argue, looking at what other countries have done, where they've combined the portfolios of climate change, environment and energy, and there is a case for that here in Ireland. We also believe that the SCAI should have its remit extended to look after the implementation or the coordination of the National Mitigation Plan. There's a lot to be said that disclosure, carbon disclosure, in line with CDP Ireland's protocols should be advanced. And if you really want to get a perspective on what the business community should be doing in this, read a speech of a few weeks back by Mark Cagney, who is the Governor of the Bank of England, who scared the living daylights out of a conference of Lloyd insurers when he talked about the risks inherent in climate change that have been ignored by the British business community and the consequent threats to financial stability in the UK because the UK business community was burying its head in the sand. I would also argue, myself and Denis, that we have a national expert panel on climate change. We need a counterpart task force, a low-carbon task force comprising the leaders of business, the agri-food industry, the construction sector, the forestry sector, and consumer interests. We can't just have an academic panel telling us what to do. We actually need the business community and related people sitting in a parallel environment or forum to help government deliver these targets. So I'll sit down while you can have a read of that.